As we all know, November 11th is Remembrance Day here in Canada. To honor Remembrance Day, our guest speaker is Lieutenant Colonel Lawrence Hatfield. He's had a dedicated military career for over 31 years, including 2 deployments to Afghanistan. He's currently the commanding officer of 56th Field Artillery Regiment and is here today to speak to us about the regiment's history. Please welcome Lieutenant Colonel Lawrence Hatfield.
Thank you for having me. So I'm just going to share my screen here. Okay, so I was asked to come speak about the regiment's history today, and this is one of the things that I can tell you is a labor for love for me. I've been in command of the regiment since 2018 and spent quite a bit of time exploring and in some cases discovering the regimental history, and it's quite an amazing history that really does cover a whole bunch of Southern Ontario. The regiment is 154 years old as of the last September, and it spans over, it goes back as far as the War of 1812 and to the present, to our service in Afghanistan. And the latest chapter of the regiment is just in terms of volunteering to be a part of the Canadian Forces efforts with the pandemic, which what we call Operation Laser. So my intent today is to take people through the history, and certainly if anyone has any questions, they can certainly at any point pop in. I'm happy to answer questions. In my agenda today, you'll see that our regiment, even though it's an artillery regiment, goes back over many different types of combat units, from artillery to dragoons to infantry. Take you through the War of 1812 to the both World Wars, Afghanistan, the Cold War, including some pretty famous people that have served in the regiment, our battle honors and our colors, distinctions, and then just talking about honoring our history. And it's really important, I think, that we talk about history, because we have a saying in our regiment that our history was born in battle and written in blood. So in 56 Field, we all wear our uniforms because we believe that we serve in the shadows of some great men and women that have gone before us. So it is important to know that 56 Field Regiment spans well over, I calculated the other day, about our area is about 6,000 square kilometers. So it includes Brant, Haldimand, Lincoln, Norfolk, Welland counties, as well as Mississaugas of the New Credit and 6 Nations of the Grand River. And the photograph you'll see there is a group of soldiers from the First World War, the 4th Battalion, also known as the Mad Fourth. And so because we have this lineage that spans over a very large part of Ontario, and that goes over many different types of units, we perpetuate and honor. So perpetuate means that it's in our family history. So it would be our father, grandfather, great-grandfather, and then we have the regiments that have also been linked to us as well. So in military, we're all about badges and as identifying different units. So there's 24 different badges that you'll see up there that represent the 35 regiments, battalions, and batteries of our history. And of course, we're an artillery regiment now, and our artillery lineage does go back to the War of 1812. So in the Niagara area, there were volunteer batteries that fought in that war, that continued on in different forms all the way up to the 10th Battery, which is today's battery that we have in our regiment, that's headquartered in St. Catharines. Within that lineage, though, the regiment deployed 5 batteries during the First World War. And then you'll see leading up to the Second World War, there were 8 different batteries that deployed in the Second World War. And they were in St. Catharines, Brantford, and in Norfolk County. Many of them fought with distinction during the Second World War, and I'll take you through those as well. The other lineage that we have is what are called dragoons. So dragoons being cavalry, soldiers on horseback. That started with the Niagara Light Dragoons back in 1812, and then it went to be called the 2nd Dragoons to the 25th Brant Dragoons. So Brantford had a dragoon regiment here that was quite well known, named obviously after Chief Joseph Brant. They in turn were converted to be called the 10th Brant Dragoons, to the 2nd and 10th Dragoons, and now, in 1946, they were converted to artillery, and so they went from 57 Field Regiment to 56 Field Regiment, which is what we are today. So that lineage goes all the way back to 1812, and it's a lineage that we're proud of, and I'm going to show you later on how we actually make a point of honoring that lineage. The other part is the infantry lineage. So the regiment's birthday is in September of 1866, and that was with the 37th Haldeman Rifles. About a week later, the 38th Dufferin Rifles were created in 1866, and those regiments were separate regiments both in Haldeman County and Brant County here. During the Second World War, they produced 5 different infantry battalions. And then after the war, they were created the Dufferin and Haldeman Rifles. And up until 1946, the Dufferin and Haldeman Rifles then became 56 Field. And it's really interesting to note that just the past March, Sergeant Bill Anscombe, we believe, was the last known surviving member of the Dufferin and Haldeman Rifles. And Bill actually came to our Christmas dinner last December, and at our Christmas dinner, he toasted his former regiment. Turns out that Bill had quite the service history during the Second World War. He had fought in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and Northwest Europe. That's 4 different campaigns, which is quite amazing. Also on the other side, on the infantry side, it starts with the 1st and 2nd Regiments of the Norfolk Militia, who fought in the War of 1812, were a part of the Canadian part of the victory of War of 1812. They formed the 39th Norfolk Rifles. During the First World War, they were the 133rd Battalion, and then they became the Norfolk Regiment of Canada, which eventually became an artillery regiment as well. So War of 1812, it was recognized, the 3 parts of our unit had a part to play in the War of 1812, and that was the artillery company, including the drivers. So the drivers meant that the actual people on horseback bringing around the artillery pieces around, the Niagara Light Dragoons, and then the 1st and 2nd Regiments of the Norfolk Militia. And about 10 years ago, the government at the time made an effort to recognize all of those units with those historic connections back to those units in the War of 1812. So even though our official history, our official birthday is in 1866, we do trace our lineage all the way back to the War of 1812. And every regiment was given a 1812 banner of those that could, who had perpetuated those units. And on that banner, they listed battle honors. So the battle honors were the battles from which those units fought. And so that included the theater honor, meaning the defense of Canada, and included Queenston Heights, Niagara, and Detroit were those battle honors. But in our official formation of 1866 to 1914, every aspect of every area of our unit's history was very active. So each one of them had a rifle regiment. There were artillery batteries, notably in St. Catharines, the 7th Welland Canal Battery, and it was quite active. The regiments in all areas were big part of the fabric of that society there. And it was on that foundation when war was declared in 1914 Oh, before I even start, there's two aspects. We would have saw during that period volunteers, and the battery in St. Catharines fought in the Fenian raids back in 1866, and there were a number of volunteers that were that volunteered for in the Boer War in South Africa. So in fact, one of the monuments that's outside of the armories in Brantford recognizes the volunteers from Brantford that actually fought in that war in 1899. But World War I is really the first major battle since the regiments were officially created in 1866. So I picked this photo as probably one of the most best photos to illustrate the regiment's contribution during wartime. What you see in the photo is the soldiers, infantry soldiers, just about to file past an artillery battery in the background, and that does best symbolize the contributions that our regiment did made during the war. So in the First World War, the regiment did mobilize 5 different batteries. So the 10th Battery in St. Catharines, and then 32nd, 41st, 54th, and 69th. And 2 of the batteries, the ones that are in black, are the ones that actually fought in the war. The other 3 batteries were actually provided as reinforcements to the rest of them. So 10th Battery fought in almost every single engagement, major engagement of the First World War. The 41st had about a year and a half's worth of pretty intense fighting. And you'll see the photo in the top here is those are all the members of 10 Battery. So the battery would have been about 150 members strong, and those were the only ones that were left after the war of the original 150 that left in 1914. Photograph below is of the 32nd Battery, which provided a whole bunch of soldiers as reinforcements, and that they were out of Brantford. In World War I, there was altogether 6 different infantry battalions. So understanding that infantry battalion is about 1,000 soldiers. And the first is the MAD 4th, the 4th Battalion. 4th meant that they were one of the first ones to actually deploy in 1914. The 4th Battalion would have had probably close to 8,000 members in that regiment or in that battalion over time, would have sustained a number of casualties. We estimate that there's from the records at least 1,200 killed in action in the 4th Battalion. The other 5 other battalions were all raised. 36th, the 114th, the 125th, and the 215th were all raised out of Brantford and the surrounding area. The 133rd was raised out of Norfolk, and they all provided reinforcements to all of the regiments that were in the Canadian Corps at the time. One distinction is the 114th Battalion, which was known as Brock's Rangers, and it's a unique distinction because it was a regiment equally made up between men of Six Nations and men of Haldimand County, and it was the only regiment of its type really in Canadian history. One of the members of the regiment, which I'll speak a little bit later, went on to become Canada's first Indigenous general. So it's a special piece, and it's a great connection and a shared history with Six Nations that the regiment enjoys. One of the key battles that we always recognize in our regiment is the Battle of St. Julien, so also known as the Second Battle of Ypres, and that was in 1915. And we recognize it because at the time the 10th Battery was a battery that was providing support at the Battle of St. Julien. The 4th Battalion was also one of the infantry regiments there at the time. And in 1915 was a major German offensive. So Ypres in Belgium, and the Allies at the point were only holding on to a small piece of Belgium, and the Germans were trying very hard to push them out. And with this offensive that they made, it was the first time that they had used poison gas. And for the Canadians, it was the first time that the Canadians really had seen serious action and been together as a division itself. So they're in this line, and the Germans start this attack, and they use gas, and the unit to their left is a French colonial division, and the gas really hits them hard, and they break. So they start to retreat. So that means for the Canadians, their left flank is wide exposed, and the Germans are pouring through there. The 10th Battery at the time was on the far left of the Canadian line, was supporting the infantry up to the front, but because the Germans had broke through, they started to surround the 10th Battery. And so while they're trying to support the infantry, they're getting attacked by German soldiers within about 200 yards of their position. So the battery commander at the time took two of his guns, his 18-pounder guns, and turned them in 180 degrees just to defend themselves. The battery, as I said, about 150, sustained about 110 casualties that day between killed and wounded. But they held their ground, and it's one of the most heroic defenses in really Canadian artillery history. The young man you'll see on the right-hand side in the photo, his name was Lieutenant Cameron Brant. He was a member of the 4th Battalion, and he died at the Battle of St. Julien. He was the first man from the Six Nations who was killed in action. And incidentally, he was the great-great-grandson of Chief Joseph Brant. And so he was a notable member and one of the first casualties in our 4th Battalion. St. Julien, as I said, it's one of those battles that is in Canadian artillery lore. It is a heroic defense. It is one of those things where Canadians stood their ground, and it really is that part where the Battle of St. Julien and the Second Battle of Ypres, it's where Canadians are shown to be, even though they've had little experience, that they show that they have that fighting spirit and determination. The other pivotal is that everybody's heard of is Vimy Ridge, and I highlight this because both the 10th Battery and the 4th Battalion were at Vimy Ridge. You'll see just up in the left corner there is a maple leaf with a 4 inside of it. So all of the badges for the battalions in the First World War were usually based on a maple leaf. We had this numbered system for our battalions, and that badge itself was carved into the tunnels that were leading up to Vimy Ridge. So this large coordinated attack, and it really is a large Canadian piece of feat of arms. It is, if you read Pierre Burton's book on Vimy, it's about where Canada became a country because we showed what we can do on our own. And I saw this when I visited Vimy Ridge some years ago, how it was carved right into the wood, or right into the chalk, because there's limestone, and what they did was they built tunnels leading up to the front so they could surprise the Germans. But it did represent a pivotal point in regimental history for both the battery and the battalion. It really is unbelievable to see, to really understand what life was like for the soldiers before us. I've said before that I don't believe that my worst day in Afghanistan would have come close to the challenges and the suffering that the men of the First World War would have had to face, or even the Second World War. Like, if you look at the photos, and some of them left in 1914 and didn't come back to, until 1919, if they made it back. And the conditions and the misery and just the death was, it's hard to understand how they survived. And not only just survived, but how did they persevere and beat an enemy that was well equipped and well trained. So it's a constant inspiration for those of us in uniform today, because we can try as much as we want. I don't think we'll ever live up to the standard of those guys that came before us. I've in the Second World War, again, For the Second World War, it was entirely an artillery show for this regiment. It started off with our battery in Brantford. So at the time, Brantford's battery, which was known as 5-4 battery, was judged to be the very best in the entire Canadian Army. So this is not just soldiers saying, oh yeah, we're the absolute best. No, they were, through assessments and through gunnery competitions, judged to be the very best battery. So when war was declared in 39, and the Canadian government wanted to send over the 1st Canadian Division, the regular force, or at the time it was called the permanent force, they didn't have enough batteries to fill out their regiment. So they picked 5-4 battery to go with them. So they were the ones picked because they were so good at the time. They were called C/5-4 battery. And so they were the first militia, as we were called at the time. They were the first gunners that were in France. And if you saw the movie Dunkirk and the heroics of how they escaped out of Dunkirk, well, Brantford's gunners were actually still in France 3 weeks after Dunkirk. They went on to serve with the Royal Canadian Horse Artillery for the entire war, and they were known as B Battery for the rest of the war. The picture in the bottom you'll see is the king at the time in 1940 inspecting the regiment and the battery in England. So we're quite proud of that piece of history. The next is our battery in St. Catharines. They were quickly mobilized as well. They served the entire campaign in Italy. And one of the things that we were honored with is you'll see a little badge in the bottom right-hand corner, and you'll see the patch of tartan behind it. So one of the battles for what's called the Gothic Line. So the Gothic Line was a defensive line in Italy. And there was an infantry regiment called the 48th Highlanders, and when they had started the attack, they were cut off, and they were in danger of being essentially overrun and either killed or captured. The artillery forward observation officer that was with them. He called into the 10th battery, and they kept calling down artillery fire on the Germans, and essentially prevented them. They saved them. They prevented them from being cut off and captured. Or even killed. And at the end of that, the 48th Highlanders came out and they gave a piece of tartan and said, you know, we would be honored if you wore a piece of tartan on your uniform to recognize the great service and support you've given to the 48th. So we just 2 years ago, the 48th came down and gave us a small piece of tartan for our pipes and drums to wear in recognition of the honor that was earned back in the Second World War. The other piece is that we mobilized 5 different anti-aircraft batteries. So they served from everywhere from Italy, in the United Kingdom, in the Battle of Britain, the Northwest Europe. We had batteries that would have landed sometime after on Juno Beach and was with the Canadian Army throughout. In fact, one of the batteries, the 69th battery, had one of the best records for shooting down enemy aircraft in the entire Canadian Army. So that was another piece that was important. The last part of the World War II service was the 33rd Anti-Tank Battery. So they were headquartered in Norfolk County. They were mobilized as an anti-tank battery. So they were operating these M10 tank destroyers. They landed just after in Juno Beach. I think it was about 3rd of July. They landed in France. They fought with distinction throughout the entire European campaign. They particularly distinguished themselves in the Battle of the Scheldt. So when the Canadian Army came and liberated Amsterdam, one of the things they had to do was clear out the entire Scheldt estuary so that ships could come in and resupply them. Well, the Germans, if you have any knowledge of the terrain in Holland, they had flooded all the fields, so it made it very difficult to get around. This battery was called, essentially for each and every town that got liberated, they would come in and provide the necessary fire support and punch to be able to get through. So they were definitely recognized as having fought with distinction in that campaign. After the war, the number of regiments did, as we demobilized, we started to reduce the number of units, and we reduced down to our present day, which is 56 Field. And we became primarily a primary reserve unit. You can see at one point we were equipped with anti-aircraft guns, and then we went from having medium howitzers to what we have today, which is the 105 millimeter C3 howitzer. So there's been countless numbers of gunners that have served in the regiment since 1946, when 56 Field was created. And the next time that our gunners were called to serve was in combat was Afghanistan, and the regiment mobilized per capita, meaning the percentage amount of people we had one of the highest per capita mobilizations of any reserve unit in the war in Afghanistan. And they were primarily with the batteries that were in Afghanistan. They were firing, what you'll see there is the M777 howitzer. It's a 155 millimeter howitzer that's capable of delivering a shell over 40 kilometers. And with the technology we have today, it's actually capable of providing a GPS guided shell, which would be pinpoint on within meters type of accuracy. So we have over 60 members of the regiment that are Afghanistan veterans. To take you through some of our notable members, obviously most proud of the fact that of our 4th Battalion Canadian Expeditionary Force is Sergeant William Merrifield. He won the Victoria Cross at the Battle of Canal du Nord. Essentially, he took a machine gun post by himself that was holding up the advance. And he was very fortunate to have survived the war. And our armories in Brantford is named after Sergeant Merrifield. Another important part is General Harry Career, who ended up becoming the commander of the 1st Canadian Army in Europe. So he commanded hundreds of thousands of Canadian soldiers. During the First World War, he was a battery commander for 10 Battery out of St. Catharines. So he went on through obviously lots of years and experience, but being a battery commander in 10 Battery to be the entire commanding general of the Canadian Army in the Second World War. Lieutenant General Ashton, a Brantford native, was the commanding officer of the Dufferin Rifles. He was a battery commander for the 32 Field Battery in Brantford. He commanded one of the 36th Battalion, and then he rose to the ranks, and by the Second World War, just before it, he was the Canadian Army's Chief of the General Staff, which is in the peacetime army at the time, the highest rank that you could achieve in the Canadian Army. Other notable members, General King, who at the Battle of St. Julien was the battery commander. He went on to become a Major General and the commander of the Royal Artillery 4th Division in the First War. Brigadier General Martin, he was one of the members of the 114th Battalion, which is the Indigenous Six Nations and Men of Haldimand County Battalion. He was the first commanding officer of our Dufferin and Haldimand Rifles and the first Indigenous general. He was also the first Indigenous magistrate in the province of Ontario. Very accomplished men and soldiers that have been in our ranks. The last is 4 other generals that have served in 56 Field, and they've, from service in the First War, Second War, to post-war, to just recently, Major General Hines, who just retired from the Canadian Forces 2 years ago. He had served in Brantford, left as a sergeant, and went on to retire as a Major General himself. One thing I'll touch on is the concept of colors. So we have a wide concept of colors in the art. The colors are usually something that indicate the regiment's identity and its battle honors. In a regular infantry regiment, they're flags. You can see the Union Jack type of color, that would be known as the Queen's color. That's one of them for one of the CEF battalions. If you were in a rifle regiment, your colors were placed on your drums, as you can see with the drum of the Dufferin and Holloman rifles. But in the artillery, our colors are the actual artillery pieces themselves. So the artillery piece in the middle is a 25 pounder that is what was in use during the Second World War. And that particular 25 pounder was restored to mint condition and is now in the Brantford Canadian Military Heritage Museum, and it comes out on parades with us. Just below that, the one with the big wagon type of wheels, is an 18 pounder, which was would have been the colors during the First World War. And then just at top, you'll see a group of soldiers, and that's actually at the Norfolk County Fair, where we do a Warriors Day parade. And just to the left in that photo is our current howitzer, which is the C3 howitzer, which is a 105. We do mark a couple of occasions throughout the year. In Brantford is the Battle of St. Julien, which we've spoke about. In Brantford, it's Warriors Day. Warriors Day is usually the last Saturday in September, Valour Day, which is the last Saturday in September, and it marks the regimental birthday, and as it well marks the Victoria Cross of Sergeant Merrifield. He was awarded that Victoria Cross for his actions on the 1st of October. You'll also see that last year on Valour Day, we actually presented a refurbished German howitzer that sits in front of our armories. That howitzer was gifted to the city of Brantford by Brantford soldiers during the First World War. And what they did is they had captured this howitzer, and it was sent back to Brantford in appreciation for all the support that the city, both through war bonds and through war industry, had given to the war effort. And really, we could do a separate presentation just on Brantford's war effort, because it is very impressive. But it was so nice to see the city refurbish that. So we did a ceremony where we actually rolled it through the streets of Brantford on parade, and then put it back in its refurbished state. And then the last we do is Warriors Day, and that's it was a tradition started by First and Second World War veterans after the Second World War, that veterans would march to the Norfolk County Fair in recognition of the long service of the men of Norfolk County. We restarted that last year. Unfortunately, COVID put a damper on it this year, but we look forward to the day that it comes back. Look, we do our best. I would like to think that soldiers are the best at remembering our past. It is a part of our dynamic. It's a part of our DNA. One of the things that we've done is a very bit of a symbolic measure. You'll see in the bottom right-hand photo, we have a mascot, and it's a Clydesdale horse, and his name is Ogisto Brant. And Ogisto, we were given that name by one of the gunners from Six Nations, and it's Mohawk for meaning ball of fire in the sky. And his second name, Brant, obviously is related to or is in honor of Brant County and Brantford. And he is configured to look like a ammunition carrier. So it's a ceremonial position, but if you look on the left, you'll see the ammunition horses from the First World War. And a part of this is also recognizing the service of horses. We were, in the First World War, a horse-drawn army. Guns and ammunition were brought to the front by horses. And unfortunately, millions of horses perished in that conflict. And so it's just one small way that we recognize a whole bunch of things through a symbolic gesture. For us, this is a picture of soldiers last year on exercise. And I always like to say to the soldiers, history is everything. And at any point, if you think that it's hard, that it could be worse. And there isn't, as I said, anything we do today that hasn't been worse for the people that have gone before us. So their service and their sacrifice is a constant reminder of the standards that those of us who wear the uniform have to live up to. The last thing I'll say is we'll just talk about some of the distinctions of the unit. It's the second oldest unit in the Royal Canadian Artillery, formed in September 1866. We perpetuate over 35 different regiments, battalions, and batteries. Our 10th battery in St. Catharines is one of the longest continually serving batteries in the Canadian Army. The 4 battle honors from the War of 1812, that the 10th battery and the 4th battalion, they fought in every single battle in the First World War that the Canadian Corps was involved with. So Brantford and St. Catharines were there at every step of the way. 8 of the batteries that fought in the Second World War was in every Canadian theater of World War II. We were the first gunners to actually see service in the Second World War, and that we've had one of the highest volunteer rates for the war in Afghanistan. We have deep connections to the Six Nations community. We perpetuate the only joint Indigenous battalion, and we had the first Indigenous general. I'm very proud of that piece of our history. And 8 members of our regiment went on to become generals. And of course, we have the only Victoria Cross recipient for an artillery regiment. And you'll see that there's even though I said there's 12 distinctions, I've only listed 11, because what I tell our soldiers is we are trying to write number 12 right now. So we are perpetually always trying to do that. And there are a couple of things that our regiment is proud of today. I mean, we're one of the largest and fastest growing units in the country. You know, we take pride in the way that we train people and recognize as a leader for our training. Every time there's been a domestic crisis, the soldiers from 56 Field always step up to the plate. 65% of our regiment, for when we had the pandemic, volunteered for service to help out fellow Canadians. And some of our people were in these long-term care facilities that the military was deployed to. We're one of the first regiments to be given a secondary task of working with the regular force in this M777 troop. And right now we have 7 of our members in Latvia. They're deployed with our regular force unit, a companion unit, and they're in that place to essentially to deter aggression in the Baltic states. And it's one of the first times that instead of sending augmented people, we've sent a detachment of our own. So it's a pretty big deal for us at this stage. That's soldiers now. So those are the people that currently serve in 56 Field who are trying to, as I said, live up to that standards of those set before us. And look, that's these are group photos from the First and Second World War. These were the faces that established our regiment's history, the proud history, and these are the faces today that I'm hoping that will continue to live up to that standard and write a new chapter when called upon to do so. It's been my absolute pleasure to talk about regimental history. I love it. It's always an inspiration for me, and it's an inspiration for our gunners. And I'm happy to answer any questions or anything like that.
Okay. I guess that's my cue to jump in. First of all, thank you so much for that. There's clearly a lot in there that Brantford can be proud of. Thank you so much for sharing it with us. And I see we do have 2 questions waiting for us. And while I'm reading this out, if anyone listening would like to ask a question, please do type it into the Q&A feature in your Zoom window. Okay, so first, someone asked if you could clarify, what is the difference between field artillery and another kind of regiment? And I'm not sure I asked that correctly, but.
No, okay, so in our path, field artillery would be what you'll see is the gun with 2 wheels on either side, and it fires a projectile, usually what we call indirect, meaning when we fire it, the people who fire it don't actually see the target that they're hitting. It's observers that are figuring out. And We just had an exercise this weekend, and when you see these young people figure out the math of from the people who are watching it, calling in the coordinates to the command post, and then doing it both by hand and computer, because you do both methods, and then giving that data to the artillery to where to fire it, it's pretty impressive. So that's what we call field artillery. In our history, we've also had air defense artillery, which is guns capable of shooting down aircraft. And we've also had anti-tank artillery, which is usually it's a specific type of gun mounted on a tank, or it can be towed, but it's designed specifically to shoot tanks directly, so tanks that you can see.
Right. That makes sense. Thank you for clarifying. The other question we had is a question to you. What made you decide to go into the Army, and how did you end up in field artillery?
Yeah, that's another one in itself. Look, I got in, I believe it or not, I've been in for 31 years. So I got in 1989. I've always had an interest of being in the military. Believe it or not, I started off in St. John's, Newfoundland. So I started off as a combat engineer, and in 1995, I got accepted to law school in Windsor, Ontario. And one of the great benefits of being in the primary reserve is usually wherever you go in Canada, there's a primary reserve unit there. So when I moved to Windsor to go to school, I actually changed to the infantry and joined a regiment there called the SS Kent Scottish. Next step for me is when I got a job in Hamilton, I moved to the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, and I was there for 18 years and I had made my way to be the commanding officer there. I can tell you that I unfortunately understand loss more than I would like to. I was the CO of the Argylls when Nathan Cirillo was shot and killed at the National War Memorial. It was a very hard time for our unit, and such a very to lose a soldier in such a public fashion. But after that, after a period of time, I was given an unbelievable opportunity to come to Brantford. This unit is comprised of, well, men and women that are some of the most professional I've worked with in my 31 years. The things that they're able to accomplish always inspire me, and it's been an absolute pleasure. Like just having, it is, we call it in the military the privilege of command. It is clearly a privilege to command such fine young men, women here in Brantford.
Okay. Oh, let's see. I think we have one more question here. Okay, I'll just read it out. I'm really impressed with the current activities of the regiment and also with what I've read about your experience in the Army. Do you see your wide experience as one of the reasons the regiment is being called on to participate with the regular forces?
Yeah, I believe the regiment's doing very well. I like to say to the soldiers, I draw the same comparisons to back in 1940, meaning that the regiment was doing so well in 1940. The officers and the NCOs were working so hard that they were so good at their jobs that when they were needed, they were called first. So in the same way, the gunners that we have are performing very, very well. You know, so yeah, I don't think there's any question that when they needed people, they had lots of choices, but they picked 7 from they picked a detachment from 56, and we're quite proud of it as well. The last photo that I showed up in my question was my 7 gunners that are in Latvia right now, and that picture's only like 3 days old. So they're doing a fantastic job over there.
Excellent. Okay, I think that's it for the questions so far. So let me just once again thank today's guest speaker, Lieutenant Colonel Hatfield of the 56th Field Artillery Regiment. We've learned a lot here today, and if any of you watching are interested in learning more about local military history, obviously there are a lot of places around the city you can look. I'd encourage you to make a future plan to visit the local history room at the main branch of the Brantford Public Library as a place to start, and checking the online resources available through our website. Thank you all for joining us today. I hope you'll all remember to observe 2 minutes of silence at 11 a.m. on November 11th in remembrance of those who fought for the freedoms we enjoy today and those who continue to serve Canada during times of both conflict and peace. Thank you all so much for coming today. Thank you again, Lieutenant Colonel Hatfield.
Well, I'll say one thing. If you're interested in the regiment itself and the history, we're very active on social media. So the regiment has a Facebook page. And we try very hard to not only show you what we're doing today, but show you where the history comes from and each week. So it's 56 Field Artillery Regiment on Facebook, and by all means, have a look.